We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
There are many sources of energy available.
Everything is energy. My God, do we need this or what? Free our mind.
Corporations have taken over the world.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
Hello, you're very welcome once again to the Irish Side of the Moon. This is Michael Leddy at the microphone, and the guest is Seth Farber. Seth Farber is a writer, a social critic, and a dissident psychologist. He is the co-founder of the Network Against Coercive Psychiatry, and he's talking to us today on the Irish Side of the Moon about his brand new book, The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry, and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement. And I'm on the line right now with Seth Farber. Hello, Seth. How are you today?
Yeah. Hi, Michael. Thank you. Very well, thank you.
Good. I'm very glad to hear it. I have in my hand a copy of The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry, and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement. And as is customary on the Irish Side of the Moon, before we talk about the book, before we talk about your message, we like to find out a little bit about yourself, about the guest. And I always ask people to turn the clock back to their formative years, as it were. I'd be interested in knowing, what was it in your, we'll say even your teenage years, that set you on this path? What were you reading? What was influencing you that kind of set you on the path that you have followed in adult life?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it directly set me on this path because I wasn't reading I wasn't reading books on psychiatry and psychology for the most part. However, you want me to speculate the connections and the links?
Oh yeah, well, if you don't mind, yeah, if it's anything that you think would be interesting.
Oh,
because
yeah, well,
obviously,
I have to say that I did start as a nonconformist pretty early, so I didn't like aspects of society from the time I was 11 or 12, and I don't think it's improved. It's gotten worse. So for one thing, this was in the 60s that I would have been 11 or 12. For one thing, I was opposed to, I read a book called, it might be more well known in Britain, called Summerhill, when I was like 11 or 12, and I decided that the way schools, compulsory education was, I figured that not a useful way to learn, and it wasn't, it violated the rights of the individual. So and then that put me at odds with the kind of a basic institution of society, the educational system.
and that common thread runs really through your work. I mean, the part of your work is very much about social commentary, and you're very aware of, and you said it there a moment ago, about the situation the world is in, and you're very critical and aware and critical of it. So it's something that's always been with you, even before you were even a teenager.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then, what then began to lead you towards psychiatry, towards the kind of that element in terms of studies, or what made you think that that was a way forward? What made you think that that was a path to follow?
Right. Okay. I should just say that in college and in high school, I was in the like many people were in America, in the anti-Vietnam War movement. So I thought I wanted to be a teacher at that time. But at any rate, that turned out to be a detour. But I decided by 1976 that, well, I decided a career as an actor, which was something I considered for a while because
Okay.
it was a rather risky thing to do, and I naively at the time thought I could make a contribution to humanity and make a nice living at the same time by being a psychologist. And at that time, in that way, I was what I would say now, I was brainwashed by the whole attitude towards psychologists, and a lot of the stuff reading about the Freudian. I was reading Freudian stuff, and I guess that was my model that I could. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it now because I after about. I went into graduate school in '76, and it took a couple of years to get in. First, I had to go back and make up classes I hadn't had in psychology. But by the time I got out in '85, from having been a true believer in the Freudian paradigm, I became not just an apostate, but I regarded it as pernicious, and I was. Well, it's similar to Jeffrey Masson, but I didn't get as high up in the Freudian ranks. I don't know if Jeffrey's as well known in Europe as he is in America. He wrote the book exposing Freud as someone who tolerated and rationalized child abuse.
Okay.
He wrote. He was on the front page of Time magazine. He wrote the Assault on Truth. So that was the kind of trajectory I took from being a.
And from your perspective, like on your personal journey, was it a gradual change in perspective, as you say, coming into the mid-'80s, or was there some incident or some life lesson in particular that brought things into sharp focus for you in those years?
I guess it was kind of, no, I mean, well, it wasn't something in between, because
Okay.
I had been having, I was finishing my PhD in '84 and still believed in psychoanalysis, Freudian. This was before the biopsychiatric idea had conquered. And by the way, even though I believed in psychoanalysis, from the very start, I wanted to work with so-called schizophrenics, and I found them to be fascinating people who were not treated well by the psychiatric establishment.
And that was always your belief, so you were always, even in the very start, you always thought that.
Yeah, except in the beginning, even though I thought that, I thought, well, maybe some of the Freudians or the few Freudians, Bert Karen is one. In those days, there was before my time. It started with someone named John Rosen, who it turned out abused his clients, but he was one of the first Freudians to say that schizophrenics were not incurable. So I was reading that kind of stuff too, and that way I was a dissident, because the whole profession regarded schizophrenics as incurable, and I rejected that. And I had read R.D. Laing and found his ideas fascinating. I read him when I was an anti-war student, before I even anti-war protester and student in university, and I had no intention then of going into psychology, but his critique of society and the politics of experience, I thought was profound. So by the time I finished in '84, I was already disturbed by the way the mental health profession treated people who were schizophrenics, and I just happened to take a course in family therapy, and that's when I felt free to abandon the Freudian model. It was like I was clinging to it as the only way I could maintain my identity as a therapist. and do something and remain in the field and do something of value. Then after I read about it, I decided to I was on the West Coast, and I decided to come back to the East Coast where I grew up. So I went back from New York. I was staying and getting my PhD in California. I got my PhD. Came back to New York to study with Salvador Minuchin and Jay Haley. I don't know if those. They were the two at that time. They were among the two top family therapists in the world. Now, they had a completely different model. They too had started out as Freudians, they were 20, 30 years older than me, so as everybody did in their day and age, and rejected it. And the exciting thing was here they were doing family therapy and things with people who were supposed to be chronically mentally ill and never incurably mentally ill, permanently mentally ill, never able to live a decent life. It was such a. In fact, in those days, it was even as short a time ago as the 70s and early 80s. I think the image of the schizophrenic was even worse than it is today. It was once you had that label, it was regarded as basically the end of your life for you, and that was conveyed to me when I went to job interviews and would say, well, what are you doing to help these people? And they would laugh like they had help these people. We can't help them. We just get them through the day. And this was considered, legitimate, state-of-the-art, quote-unquote, treatment. And so I was pleased then to study with Minuchin and Haley, and found out that they were doing things with people who had labels like borderline personality disorders. Bipolar didn't become famous. It didn't become as fashionable until the later in the 80s and the early 90s here in America. So I'd meet bipolar, but not as much. But there were plenty of borderline personalities, and these narcissistic, and all of these things from the Freudian perspective were really kind of hopeless cases. And the best you could do is spend years with them, and then maybe after years, a very small number would be able to be saved. Anyway, at this point, I did have a kind of a breakthrough experience when I went to the conference in 1985 called The Evolution of Psychotherapy. And I was already studying with Minuchin, but I just started. And but this was from all over the world. This Thomas Zaz, who just died, rest in peace.
Yes.
Was there, and Tom and Artie Lang was there, and Haley and Minuchin, all the innovative people in therapy. It was at the Milton Erickson Foundation. So you had all the people who were famous for being innovators. Plus you had a few Freudians thrown in, and it was then I started writing my first article on the.
This is my next question, because my next question is, where does writing get into the picture? How does this fit into the picture? And how did you find that was useful to you personally with regard to getting your viewpoint out into the world?
Well, in the beginning, I just, my first article was just for a scholarly journal, and it really doesn't have much impact, but it gave me more confidence in.
Yes, of course. Yes, that's very important. And that's very important when you're dealing with your own beliefs, isn't it? Because to be confident, and this is something that you share with all the guests virtually on Irish Side of the Moon, being confident enough in your beliefs and your convictions to follow through and put them out on a wide scale, that requires confidence, and it does start with small steps. So any article is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I remember, I think I was having this conference was there were 10,000 people attending this conference. between 5 and 10,000. It was an enormous conference, and I told, yeah, and there's one lady was defending what was called the disease, or the medical model, or the disease model, the idea that there is such a thing as mental illness, and I was critical of it, but I had never written about it, and I had only become critical of it in the last 2 or 3 years. Actually, there was one incident before I graduated when I realized, it was this kind of sudden realization that I was not going to call people mentally ill anymore. I was dealing with one client who, from their point of view, was seriously mentally ill. She was a transsexual client, pre-operative. I don't know what happened to her. This was in 82 or 83, but that really didn't matter. They did, yeah, go on.
No, but yeah, tell me. So you were very, very conscious of the labeling, and you're very, very, very unwilling to participate in that, the idea.
Once it was what my supervisor said, she's a very sick person. Somehow I left there and I was thinking, first I started thinking that way, and then I realized, well, if I start thinking that way, to be consistent, I'm going to have to subject all of my own activities to that same hermeneutic.
I like it. And it goes to show how dangerous a certain way of thinking can be, in the sense that you start labeling people a certain way and then you must follow through on that, because it becomes reality. As you label things, that can become your reality.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
And it generates the data that seems to confirm it. So,
okay, we've talked about you starting to write. Talk to me now about your books. Talk to me about as you started to flex the muscle more confidently. Tell me a little bit about that and what that was like for you as you started to put your views on, this time, a more wide stage, to a wider audience.
You mean after the journal articles?
Yes, exactly. Perfect. Yes.
Well, actually, I should say the second journal article, even though it didn't reach a wide audience, it introduced me to the dissidents within the mental health field.
Ah. Okay. Now this is important as well, because I'll tell you again, a recurring theme with the Irish Side of the Moon guests is the idea of like-minded people. How important it is to make that connection with people who are on the same wavelength, especially if you are on a wavelength that runs contrary to the mainstream. So suddenly you had something out there, you had another article, a journal article, and you, as you said, this then brought you into contact with people who were willing to respect that point of view.
Yeah. Well, actually, even before that, after my first article, Artie Lang was in town, and I did a workshop with him, and then I met with him afterwards, and I talked to him for a while, and well, it's more interesting about Artie Lang than it was about me, but he was very, very bitter and disheartened, as he had said in public after 1987, because he didn't think his work had any impact on the field. So this second article was for the Journal of Mind and Behavior, and they did a special issue, and I was in there. I was supposed to be in there with R.D. Lang, but R.D. Lang had died in 1989. Actually, one of the things that also galvanized me and made me feel that I had a sense of that I was on the right path was I called R.D. Lang the day he died. And I was not in the habit of calling him, but I just so happened that actually I tried to reach him the day before he died, but he was not there because he was on vacation. And then so by the day I called him was the day he died. So it was only the first or maybe the second time I'd called him in my life. The time before that was in '87 to arrange to meet with him. So that made me feel that I had a connection with him and that I would carry on his work, and I've since felt it. And then, so when I wrote the second article, it resulted in my meeting Thomas Szasz, because this was all the dissidents within the field in the Journal of Mind and Behavior in the mental health field. Not all, but I mean Thomas Szasz was in that in the special issue of the Journal of Mind and Behavior, as well as Peter Bregan. I don't know if you know of him. He's pretty famous now in America for arguing that psychiatric drugs are brain damaging, and the therapeutic effect is really a brain damaging effect. So he was a number of people, and at that point I met also Ron Leifer, who was a friend of Thomas. Anyway, that resulted in my eventually, when I wrote my first book, my meeting Thomas Szasz and my getting his support, and then I ultimately wrote the foreword to my first book. So I was at that point. I had studied family therapy. I thought that I was going to change the world with family therapy, but within 2 years, it was impossible for me to get a job within the in the public sector.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, once I took a position, well, I know this great new model, family therapy, and I can cure people without these awful drugs, because I'd then run Peter Bregan, and I was doing that. I mean, people were getting better, but, you know, my position against drugs already made me persona non grata in the mental health field.
Yeah, because I mean, and I mean, this is something you go into. The idea drugs means money, and if you're anti-drugs, then there's no profit margin.
This was in the beginning, so I don't know if the money was not quite that much of a factor as the religious symbolism of the drugs. It was Thomas Szasz had spoken of schizophrenia as the sacred symbol of psychiatry. And I discovered pretty soon that one of the other sacred symbols was because in those days they weren't giving drugs to half the population in 1988 and 89. They were still mostly drugging people they considered seriously mentally ill. So, and children, because that included all these children they were labeling attention deficit disorders. But it's still multiplied about eightfold the number of people on drugs from 1990 to today.
Eightfold. It's multiplied many times over. That wow. Okay, that's scary.
No, that's what it is in America. Yeah, there are 8 million children on psychiatric drugs. But at the time, it had such symbolic significance to the drugs because they were part of their maintaining their identity as doctors, which was bogus. It was a bogus identity. Many neurologists didn't take them seriously, and even as late as 6 years ago, I don't know if you heard of the. I don't think it's pretty well known. Even in the hunger strike. That was well. You read parts of my book.
Yes, I've read most of the book, so I'm aware. But I wouldn't have been aware before that at all. Tell me about it. No, I wouldn't have been aware until I read. And
Actually, come to think of it, it's not known, and most people in America wouldn't be aware of it either, except the people I know who are in the anti-psychiatry movement.
Yeah, who are already in the yeah. Well, that's always the way. Sometimes these messages do not get out onto the mainstream. They're not, for whatever reason. Yeah, they're not featured.
The amazing thing was that they did an article about it at all in the Los Angeles Times, which was a big paper here in America. So what happened was David Oakes, who was the founder of what today is the largest mental patients liberation movement, which is called Psychiatric Survivors Movement. I don't know if those terms do those terms mean anything to you?
As in the surviving, escaping from psychiatry. Is that what you mean? Because in that context, yes.
Have you run into any people? I know there's in
personally,
Ireland
yes.
who are in
yes. Yeah, well, I would say, yeah, I have a childhood close friend who brought these issues, the issues that are in your book. I'll put it this way: I have experienced them before through a close friend that I went to school with, and through battles that they have fought that would be echoed in some of the cases in your book.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
And
not
this,
unfamiliar to me. It's definitely not unfamiliar to me.
and this person became involved in the, first it was called the Mental Patients Liberation Movement, and then it was called the Psychiatric Survivors Movement.
He's involved with a group here in Ireland. It wouldn't run by that exact name, but essentially it's the same kind of work. It's essentially the same. It's the same.
Yeah, the person that I know from Ireland is Mary Maddock. I don't know if she's well known to you.
She wouldn't, but I bet my friend would know her. Mary Maddock. I'm gonna write it down. But I bet you the guy I'm talking about will definitely know who, because as I threw out these names, your name, Thomas Az, other names to him in conversation a couple of weeks ago, he knew exactly what I was talking about. We're going to take a short break. We're coming up on our first break. When we come back from the break, you were about to talk a little bit about David Oakes and the 2003 hunger strike, etc. So I want to pick up on that thread. When we return, we're going to take a very short break on the Irish Side of the Moon. Stay on the line and we'll be right back.
This was in 2005, I believe.
Okay.
David, was it two? No, I'll look it up and tell you.
Well, I have 2003 in the notes here. I have 2003, David Oakes, hunger strike to protest the abuses of the psychiatric profession and attract public attention to their claim that the psychiatric profession was deceiving and poisoning the American public. And the date there was 03, and that's what I have taken down, so I'm presuming. But it doesn't matter too much. We're in the right area anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they went on a hunger strike, and actually when I first heard of it, I thought it was a silly idea, because I thought no one would pay attention. But it actually turned out to be something that, not only got some publicity they were in California when they were doing it, not only got local publicity, but it's kind of something that will enter into the history books. When people write about the anti-psychiatry movement, as it's sometimes called, this incident will be written about. So David Oakes and the other mental patients, all people who have been labeled schizophrenic and were functioning without drugs and even though they were supposedly schizophrenic, as functioning as social activists against the mental health system went on longer, they issued a challenge to the American Psychiatric Association. They said, you are locking people up and forcing them to take drugs. You are telling people that they need these drugs. What evidence do you have? Show us the evidence you have that there's any brain damage, that there's a biochemical imbalance. Anyway, they issued this challenge, and then the APA responded with. They also assembled a group of nonconformist psychiatrists and psychologists, about 10, to back them up. And when they would issue these statements, the professionals would respond to the APA's statement. So the APA's first statement said, well, if you want to know about the proof, go look at this book and go look at that book, and wasn't very specific at all.
No, yeah.
And the dissidents, who included not Thomas Oz, but Peter Bregan and some other people, then said, well, we looked in the book, and in fact, the book, a couple of the books one of the books was a standard psychiatric text, and the other was a report by the Attorney General. in 1999 on the biochemical basis of mental illness, and they admitted they couldn't find any. So anyway, an exchange took place. At the end of this exchange, the APA issued a statement. This was 4 months later. Was written up in the papers. They didn't look all that good, and the dissidents had managed to, for anyone who was reading it, saw a powerful critique, because some of the people who were there was Jason. A lot of these, all of these dissidents were people who had, not all of them, at least most of them, who had written in that journal with me, the Journal of Mind Behavior, in 1990. So this was 13 years before. A small group. Anyway, the APA then was forced to. They issued a statement on the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. It was kind of to me, an amusing statement, because they rebuke David Oakes and these people for trying to hinder the advancement of science by raising questions. Now, since by raising questions about the legitimacy of psychiatry, science is supposed to advance precisely through raising questions. But they basically said, shut up and just realize that it's going to take a while for us to find the. Here's the statement right in front of me, where they admit, okay, brain science is not advanced to the point. This is the point after hundreds of years, because this was the second the second quest for the brain damage, for the evidence of brain damage. It started in the 19th century when their materials were, their instruments were cruder, and it began in the 20th century again for the past 30 or 40 years. But anyway, brain science is not advanced to the point where scientists or clinicians can point to readily discernible pathological lesions or genetic abnormalities. So anyway, they can't. That's their psychobabble way. They can't point to any readily discernible or not readily discernible lesions or any abnormalities.
There's nothing. I know exactly. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Right. I want to talk about the spiritual gift of madness. I want to focus in on the book. I want to focus about your work on the book. I think there's two things I need to ask you before we start talking about the book. Talk to me, explain to me what Mad Pride is, and tell me what the Icarus Project is, please.
Well, I think the Mad Pride, the first Mad Pride organization I heard of was the one in England called Mad Pride, and founded in 1999, and they put out an anthology, which is basically mostly autobiographical pieces, but the position generally was, we're not ashamed of being mad. Madness contributes to our life. They were not. You would think they would have been influenced by Lang, but they weren't. Most of them were Trotskyists, oddly enough.
And again, the thing was ownership of who you are, and ownership of what you are, and rejection of labels, and in fact taking control of the label. The idea of, I'm a mad person, and not, as you say, saying that with any great shame.
Yeah, the thing was, the rejection of the medical model had started by mental patients, former mental patients, started in 1970 with the formation of mental patient liberation groups all over the United States. But 1999 was the first time they switched and called it Mad Pride, and rather than psychiatric survivors, and I thought that was a big step forward. I didn't.
No, it makes sense. Again, pride is a good word. Pride says a lot. You know, it's a good word. You have a reference somewhere in the book of gay pride, black pride.
Yeah.
Analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, I made that. Try to make that analogy. The movement in its beginning, still make that analogy. So movement in its beginning, similar to the black movement or gay movement tried to be, as was the black movement in the South, as white as possible. And it was only later it developed black is proud and black power and so on. So that it switches you over into a different theoretical paradigm, though, because the Thomas Zaza's paradigm is completely antithetical to mad pride for reasons that are somewhat complex to a person who's not familiar with it that I could explain. But I would say also that the Icarus Project was the first mad pride organization in America, and that was founded in 2003.
And again, the quote here, I have the page in front of me, their quote, "We believe we have mad gifts to be cultivated and taken care of, rather than diseases or disorders to be suppressed or eliminated."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, the core thing there is owning who you are and coming to terms with who you are, rather than allowing yourself to be defined and medicated.
Right, and that meant it was another step in the deconstruction of the psychiatric medical model paradigm, because in effect they were to me it was like a Langian move, and the strange thing is, I pointed out, the language of the Icarus Project was very Langian. The reason I say that's strange is because when I met with them, they never heard of Lang, and yet they were using the exact terms Lang used: breakdown, breakthrough. I mean, they had heard of him, but they'd never opened a book by Lang, the two founders of the organization. So I then tried to account for that in terms that might have been used by Carl Jung, but because there was something about the movement of the anti-psychiatry movement up until that point that was really suppressive of an aspect of the identity of so-called schizophrenics, because in a way, psychiatry is not completely wrong. They just have things turned inside out, if you know what I mean. It's not, in certain ways, it's like they're seeing reality, but they're seeing it upside down, because what they say is sane is insane. Now, R.D. Laing was the first to say this, and what they say is mad is sane.
Okay.
If that's confusing, I could explain it.
Go into it. Yeah, no, please do. Please continue. I want to hear what you have to say.
Laing, in the Politics of Experience, he wrote this at the height of the Cold War, and let's see if I have a quote from him. He was a very gifted writer. He says he said, normal men have. This was a Politics of Experience, which after was written was published in '87, became a bestseller on college campuses, and R.D. Laing became a celebrity in America. Everyone knew him. People were reading him because of his critique of society. He says, normal people have killed 100 million of their fellow normal human beings in the last 50 years. The condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, of being out of one's mind is the condition of normal man. Society highly values its normal man. It educates children to lose themselves and to become absurd, and thus to be normal. On the other hand, Laing was arguing at that time that madness could be a path to what he called hypersanity. And he gave a few examples, not many. I gave more examples in my the book that I wrote in 1993. But the examples he gave were pretty powerful. People who went on spiritual voyages, what Laing called the voyage into the inner world, which was, and were of course labeled schizophrenic. But from the psychiatric standpoint, a voyage into the inner world is schizophrenia. I always like to remind people that that the great spiritual icons, teachers, avatars of Western or Eastern civilization are in fact schizophrenics by the standard of psychiatry.
Yeah, you used Paul as an example. You used St. Paul as one example, which is, it's really leaps out at the reader.
Yeah. But yeah, Paul was my favorite example in this book because I like because he was a prophet who made we wouldn't have heard of Christianity if it wasn't for Paul. So on the road to Damascus, he heard or saw what psychiatrists would say he had a hallucination, and the normal person might say hallucination because Paul was there with his companions, but only Paul saw Jesus, and only Paul heard Jesus saying to him, Saul, which was his name obviously at that time, why do you persecute me? And as a result of that, from the psychiatric standpoint, hallucination, Paul went from being a persecutor of Jews who believed in Jesus, because at that time Jesus was speaking to Jews. He was trying to convert Jews, not what today is, not the Gentiles, what today we call Christians. So that it was that psychotic breakdown that led Paul to become a believer that in Christianity, and led him to become a prophet who went preaching to the Gentiles at that point. And if it wasn't for Paul, we wouldn't have heard of Christianity. So
and that's something that does come across as well as one of the many things that comes across from reading the book. But the idea that in the modern day, in 2012, that people who could be the next spiritual leaders, the next prophets, if you will, could be out there, but could, as a consequence of their behavior, be medicated and silenced.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, when I wrote my book on Christianity, I mean, even Jesus, back in the early 20th century, it was common to write psychoanalysis of Jesus, and all these books said Jesus was paranoid, schizophrenic, and so on and so forth. I mean, he had delusions of reference. He was narcissistic. Actually, this started with Albert Schweitzer because Jesus thought he was the Messiah. So, at any rate, and that one of the more interesting quotes was a modern believer in the biochemical model, and he said, it's too bad that modern psychiatry wasn't around in the time of Jesus, because had it been around, we would have been able to help Jesus, and he would have been able to return to his trade as a carpenter.
I like it. I like that. I like it.
To them, the absolute standard of normality is working at a 9-to-5 job.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And if you step outside the norm, then yeah, you are in the crosshairs. You have it here on one of the pages I highlight as I read, and I see page 273. Psychiatrists are certain that a mad person's claim to have a mission is a symptom of their illness. So if you have an absolute passionate conviction and you need to carry this out, and it's all consuming, and it's it's now the drive of your life to get a message out, you are in fact ill and should be medicated as such.
Yeah, certainly. If you say that you have a divine mission, a God-given mission, yeah, that's always been the case. And what I'm trying to do is to take the mad pride model that began to develop and revive it, because no sooner did it begin to develop than the people who developed it started distancing themselves from it, from the idea that people who were schizophrenics had a mad gift that made them capable and able to make a contribution to helping or changing or saving the world. So, as myself a believer in the what I call in the book a messianic view, perspective, a messianic redemptive paradigm of madness and social change, I think that the mad pride movement that's based on that kind of meta-narrative takes seriously the idea that Jesus, and you look at it from two angles. On the one hand, you have the great spiritual leaders, at least in the West, Jesus, St. Paul, and this was first written about in 1930 by Antoine Boisson, who was worked in a loony bin, and he himself had, he was a chaplain. But he himself had a breakdown in 1920 and was told he was a schizophrenic, and he recovered, which was unheard of at that time. But he was the first to point out these commonalities between all his patients and the great spiritual leaders and geniuses, as he called them, throughout history. And he didn't quite know what to make of it. But in my first book, I use the shaman as an example, but in this book, I'm more interested in conscripting in people into people who are labeled schizophrenic into catalysts of spiritual, social transformation within society. Since we're at a stage where the usual methods of getting by or of patching things up are not going to work. We're in such a dire straits as a society that the usual methods. Well, first of all, in America, things have gotten much worse. We used to have a state that, to some degree, the government regulated the corporations. I mean, you could count on in psychiatry we now see how Bob Whitaker points this out in his books on Anatomy of an Epidemic, how they become completely subservient to the drug companies. Well, we find that with the EPA too, which is even more alarming. All of these regulatory agencies that at one point represented the general common interest of society and protected it from the private interests of corporation are now in the hands of so you have the famous aphorism of the fox guarding the chicken coop.
Yeah. And it's scary. It's very bleak, and it's a very scary image. And it's accurate as well. You're not the only person telling us this on the Irish Side of the Moon. It's fascinating for me interviewing people with different messages, different ideas, different books, and yet there are so many common threads. And this is one of the common threads. The idea of how the corporation hold and the fact that money is the new god.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to build up to another break. We've built up a picture so far of yourself coming from, as you say, as far back as 11, being a nonconformist and being very much somebody who thinks in their own right. And you've painted the picture of how you looked into the idea of becoming a psychologist, even though you had some misgivings, and we saw the path that was for you, and how you eventually began to reject various teachings and various elements of it. And then we've talked a little bit about the books, the articles and the led in the books, and you've explained Mad Pride and you've explained the Icarus Project. When we come back from the break, I want to ask you about the spiritual gift of madness, the book we're here to talk about today. I want to ask you some questions about the structure of it, the people that you feature, the people that you interview in it. So stay on the line, Seth Farber, and we'll be right back with the Irish Side of the Moon. And we're back, and I'm on the line with Seth Farber. I want to talk to you about The Spiritual Gift of Madness, the book I have in my hand. It's structured around interviews. You've interviewed a small group of people. Can you tell me what set you on this path? Why did you decide to interview a small group of people and get their stories? What did you want to achieve with this book, and have you achieved it? And tell me a little bit about the people.
Yeah, well, the two reasons. One, I figured that it's always more convincing to the general public if you have stories. Well, it's also they're more likely to read stories, but it's also more convincing. I mean, I'm saying these people who you have been taught all your life to believe are schizophrenic are really the spiritual leaders that could save us from I don't want to sound like a fundamentalist by using the term Armageddon, but that because I'm not a fundamentalist, but could save us from an Armageddon type situation, the destruction of the planet through the environmental destruction.
Yep.
And here I am saying that these people that you've regarded as schizophrenic, and that are schizophrenic by psychiatric standards, are really the people who can save us. They're the wise people in the culture. They're the prophets. They're the ones who have gotten the call from God to come save us. Now, what I'm saying now is, if a psychiatrist were to turn on and hear me saying this, he would say, "Oh, that guy is himself crazy." If he didn't hear I was a psychologist, if I heard I'm a psychologist, he'd say, "Oh, he's totally eccentric and stupid." But if he didn't hear I was a psychologist, he'd say, "Oh, here's a crazy schizophrenic talking." There's an amusing incident about that. I don't know if I should get on.
Yep.
When I submitted one of my books to a publisher, he insisted on sending it out to psychologists for review before they decided whether they were going to publish it. And I warned them, they're not going to like it. I'm attacking them. Even though I'm one of them, they're still not going to like it. This is my book on Christianity against psychiatry.
Okay.
So she wrote back. He confided in me. He said he would be aware of that fact. She wrote back. This was a psychologist. "Don't touch this book with a 10-foot pole. I suspect the author is a mental patient masquerading as a psychologist."
Masquerading, I love it.
Masquerading as a psychologist.
So your first goal with this book was, as you say, getting people, because it's more convincing. What was your other goal? You said it was probably two things. You wanted to make stories.
The other goal was to explore where the movement was. Because on the one hand there was the psychiatric survivors movement, which I was well acquainted. I had interviewed David Oakes for my first book. I knew his point of view, but how did that differ from the Icarus Project, the Mad Pride movement, which I'm calling Mad Pride movement? And still is the term mad has become, even though they don't always use the term Mad Pride anymore, the people in this movement, the radicals in the movement, I'm not talking about people who call themselves consumers, let alone people who, there's a front group for psychiatry in America who call themselves victims of mental illness, NAMI. They're on the other side, Well, there are some people in there who are naive, misled people who have relatives who have problems. But the leaders, although even there the leadership is changing, but for many years they've been on the other side, pushing psychiatric drugs. But the real groups, the real liberation people, only in the last 10, 15 years have they started using the term mad frequently to describe themselves. So the mad movement is a term that's used by everybody I know. So I wanted to find out what were the differences between the two movements, and since the younger movement, the newer movement was mostly younger people, I wasn't familiar with them. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to get the answer to certain questions that I had.
So how did you go about it? I mean, you had to decide, first of all, who to interview, so you had to select people, and then you had to approach people and explain to these people what you intended was to interview them, and put their story word for word, put the interview word for word in a book. And in some cases, you actually are going to you put commentary on it, and you comment on sometimes the person's own case history and stuff like that. How did you pitch that to various people? And when you said, "Hey,
yeah, some people
this
won't
is what
talk to me. Some people
Yeah, well-
won't talk to me now.
okay, because yeah, it's an unusual project. It's unusual in my experience in terms of the structure of it and the fact that you are putting these cases out here and you put everybody's voice in the book, but then you do dwell, for instance, on, as you said, the shortcomings of the Mad Pride movement. So you're not flag waving. You're critically analysing, which is commendable and makes the book a very satisfying read. You are critically analysing everything, while getting your point across. But yeah, it must be difficult to get people to partake.
Yeah, well, I should say though that I was critically analyzing it from to use an analogy from the left. Not from the psychiatric viewpoint, but from the left rather than the right. Using as an analogy, if I was criticizing them from a viewpoint sympathetic to, I was saying they're not radical enough.
Yeah. Well, you were saying
cases.
that there's things that need to be done and aren't being done, etc. And that's, it's your thoughts and your criticisms can be used to constructively affect the future. And
I didn't think they would be. I didn't think people would be offended because every one of them in the book I present as a heroic figure who has made a contribution to the development of the movement against psychiatry.
And you use that term. You do refer to them as not just in conversation with me, but I have it here in my notes somewhere. You do talk to them as heroes and heroines. I've taken a note somewhere in one of my sections. So you do put that idea front and center.
Yeah.
They are heroic for what they have done and what they have achieved and what they are continuing to achieve.
Yeah, they proved the psychiatry wrong. Everybody agreed, although for a time since I was out of the loop, and I didn't know the younger people involved, I had to ask around a lot, and I had a hard time finding women at first. I didn't want to do the book all men, but it wasn't hard finding the men because I had people who were basically in the David Oates and Sasha had agreed. The problem for me, at least unfortunately, the people, Sasha who had evolved to a point in 2008. It took a while to find a publisher, and also in which he was in agreement with me. And by the time I got around to interviewing him, he no longer believed in Mad Pride. So I had to become more critical of him.
And there's an interesting situation because it becomes then an interview, a response to the interview, and a response to the response.
Yeah.
Which again is very unusual. It's for the reader. It's very rewarding because it encourages me as a reader to really think about what I'm reading. But from your perspective, it's obviously very different to what you originally intended. As you say, the idea of having to comment on something and having a response to that response, and it becomes like a Russian doll where you're constantly opening and revealing a slightly different version of what you've seen before.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
But, okay, so the book as it is, how long did it take to put together? Because some of these date back a couple of years. So how long did it actually take to put together this body of work?
It took me 2 years to write the rough the first what I thought was a finished copy.
Yeah.
But that included the interviews too. So there were like six interviews, including the interview with the psychiatrist. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Anyway. So that was 2 years, and then then there was the whole thing with finding a publisher, and the publisher I had not copying out and having to find another publisher. And it didn't, it really looked pretty grim of finding a publisher, because the thing is, in the 1960s, I think it would have been a snap to find a publisher. But what happened after the 60s was there were people that were leftists, and they liked to champion oppressed groups like mental patients, but generally they don't like the idea of, they wouldn't like my idea of this being a kind of a spiritual project. Yes. And that they don't, most of the leftists I know still regard any kind of religion or spirituality as the opium of the people. But of course I was saying the opposite, but that didn't matter. They don't want to hear that for the most part. So, and then on the other hand, the spiritual people, a lot of New Age presses, they don't want to get involved in political social controversies. We could even see that with the way I had gotten my PhD in the California Institute of Integral Studies, which was it was set up by an Indian guru philosopher. He wasn't a guru, but he was a yogi and philosopher. And then it became a kind of a magnet for scholars all over the country, particularly after I left, who were interested in Eastern and Western mysticism. So some famous people who were famous in the field were there. But even there, when transpersonal psychology started out, they avoided controversy. People like Groff was willing to take on a bit of a controversial position by saying many people, but they weren't controversial like R.D. Lang was. They started out, they wanted the acceptance of the APA, the American Psychological Association, if not the APA, and so because of that, it was amazing. I mean, it was kind of a miracle that I found a publisher, and it was a good publisher, a big publisher that reached a wide New Age audience, and which would seem to indicate in general there's more of a receptivity on the part of people who identify with New Age to critiques of the mental health system, to what is known as the Mad Pride movement or the mental patients liberation movement. I think calling it the Mad Pride movement helps a lot, because psychiatric survivors is really such a grim term.
Yes, agreed, and I agree completely. And again, it's all to do with labeling. The very use of the word pride, it's such an optimistic word. It also speaks of ownership, and it has a positive connotation.
Yeah.
Looking at the negative side of things for just a minute here, the last couple of questions, our time is soon running out. Somebody might be listening to us now, and they're very, very much affected by these situations that are covered in your book. They might be able to they might be going through a lot of the same stuff. What are the dangers, for example, of coming off the drugs? If you're in a situation where you're listening to us talk right now, and you're possibly drugged and you feel you want to do something about it, talk to me. I mean, you can't go cold turkey. The world now is such that you can't just... How does somebody empower themselves and try and take a step back from the position they're in?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm going to answer that, but you said you only had a few minutes, and I realized that I didn't. I'm not sure I made it clear to people who are having certain kinds of experiences that they are not mentally ill. So will I have time to make
that?
You
can take as much time. What you can do is you can take as much time as you want, because we're not live. It's not a huge issue. It can be fixed around, so we don't need to cut anything. We're in the last 10 minutes of our planned interview, but if you need to talk longer than that, do talk longer than that. It will not be cut out. It'll work out.
Okay.
Some way. So talk away. There's no. I'm just letting you know that we're in the last few minutes of our planned time. So yeah, talk away. Explain to me how you respond to that particular question. The idea of somebody who's drugged, and there are dangers to simply going off the drugs.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. And first of all, I always tell people they have to get off the drugs gradually.
Okay.
The longer they've been, first of all, they should not get on the drugs. Second of all, certain drugs are worse than others. third of all, in America, they put people on not 1, 2, 3, but 5, 6, 7, 8 drugs now. I've heard that they're lowering it, but that it's not quite as many. They're going in the other direction, but they do this, according to the psychiatrist I interview, because they're making more money that way.
Yes.
The drug companies are making more money, and the psychiatrists are basically drug pushers. They're working for the drug cartel. They serve a certain function for the drug cartel. They give it a legitimacy. It would be just like if they were working for the mafia selling heroin and coming along and saying, heroin is good, heroin is good for you, and they're stamping it with the approval of doctors and science and so forth. But they're really just peddling drugs that are, in many cases, are worse than heroin in terms of its effects on them. But they are, and once they are, have the same intense withdrawal effects. But what psychiatry has kept hidden from the start is when they tell people to go on these drugs, they don't tell them about the withdrawal effects. And many of the most of the experiments that have done have been flawed because they have not taken into account that people who get off a drug that they've been on for 5 or even a year or 2 or 3 or 4 are going to have withdrawal effects. So frequently they will say, we've taken you off the drug, and the people who are not on the drug had to be rehospitalized 10 times, and the people who stayed on the drug only had to be rehospitalized 3 times. And what they don't tell you and what they don't take into account is that the people who were off the drugs, who had to be rehospitalized 10 times, had to be hospitalized 10 times because part of what they didn't tell you was included in the experiment was they were getting them off the drugs.
Yeah.
They didn't go from no drugs. They didn't go from a position of no drugs into this experiment. They went from a position of being on drugs to being taken off the drugs, and they were having withdrawal effects. And anybody who's gone to a psychiatrist who's made an attempt to get off the drugs will know that the psychiatrist tells them, "Oh, your illness has come back. This shows how you need the drugs." And frequently, the psychiatrist will tell the person, "Okay, we'll get you off the drugs," and they don't do it slowly and gradually. Whereas that's the only way to do it to minimize the withdrawal effect. Anyone who gets off the drug has been on a drug for 2 or 3 years and gets off it, say the so-called antipsychotics, the so-called atypical antipsychotics, and also the atypical antipsychotics, Seroquel, Risperidol, Olanzapine, or Zyprexa, and they have a whole bunch of new ones, and I'm not even the ones that just came out in the last 2 or 3 years. But anyone who's been on these drugs would know the drugs that I'm referring to. They have powerful, so they have to get off them slowly. There are lots of books written on it, on how to approach it. But the main thing is is you're not going to. Unfortunately, it's rare to find a psychiatrist who's going to help you to do that. But there are a lot of books put out. I think there's a website in. It really doesn't matter if it's in England or if it's in Europe or in America, because it's on the internet.
On the web, yeah.
Yeah, but there is one called Mind, I believe, that they have a manual on how to get off of psychiatric drugs.
What's the name of it again? Can you repeat the name?
Mind.
Here's a question.
Also, the Icarus Project has one.
The Icarus Project, yeah, and that's one site that through research for your book, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, they have a free manual on how to get off the drugs.
Here's another question, and this is an important one. First of all, one of the people you interview, Ed Whitney, was told that he was in denial and that he was not having a spiritual crisis, which leads me to this question. For the person, again, listening to us talk who might be going through this, how how is it possible to draw the line between having a spiritual awakening and those people that might harm themselves or might harm others? That line there, where does that fall, and how can somebody know about that without knowing?
Well, on the one hand, psychiatry doesn't know that. I mean, they have absolutely no ability to predict dangerousness. But I mean, actually, I think that someone with some common sense might know it. But at any rate, when they start saying this is a symptom, you're going to get worse, and so on. This was one of my problems with the with Stan Groff's the Spiritual Emergence Network. They started saying, well, there's a small group of people who are having spiritual emergence, and the rest are schizophrenic. Basically, I don't know everyone. I haven't met very many violent people, so I'm sure if you go into a place for the criminally insane, many of those people are violent, whether they started out violent or in some cases, they were made violent by psychiatry. But, I mean, there are clearly people like that, but they're a minority. They're no greater than the percentage of violent people among the public at large. So the majority of people I've met are not, if they're having fantasies about doing violent things to other people, then you have a problematic situation. But in most cases, you don't have that situation. So, for example, I was going to give an example of one woman. The typical things that they say, and I've been very disappointed that people in the transpersonal psychology field have been too willing to fall into this model of this being a certain elite that is having spiritual experience and the rest are not. So, and that elite tends to be people who are, having true Kundalini, tend to be people who in other ways are more conventional. For example, the person who says, I'm Jesus Christ, is by someone like Stan Groff would not be considered to be in that elite of having, unless he's changed, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but 15 years ago would not have been considered someone that was having a true Kundalini experience. Yet I believe that these people are having true prophetic experiences, that the vast majority of people who are labeled schizophrenic are having spiritual experiences of one kind or another. And this is when this one woman wrote to me. No, she didn't write to me. I wrote to her. But here's an example of I quote her in the book, but I don't tell the whole story, which was I followed up with her. Here's an example. She says, I'm a 30-year, and this is common among people who are labeled schizophrenic and bipolar, and because it's common, it's why I made the statement that the majority of or certainly a large minority of people who are labeled schizophrenic are having experiences that would be considered the prophetic calling in another age, in another time. Yes. I'm a 30-year-old one, and I don't care if the experiences, the traditional criteria was how's their reality testing. I don't care how their reality testing is in terms of whether they have the potential to be a, as I indicated earlier, by standard criteria, Paul's reality testing would not be considered to be good because he was not able to distinguish between what his companions said was not taking place and what he heard was a voice. So, who is to make the judgment whether...
The judgment.
Yeah, as far as that goes, basically the mental health profession has a set of conventional criteria. And I don't think that transpersonal psychologists should be setting themselves up as gatekeepers. So this woman writes, I am a 30. I guess an example would be.
Go on. Yeah.
And in fact, all of the people in my book were having altered states of consciousness. So I'm a 31-year-old mom, and I have bipolar disorder and with psychosis. When I go into mania, I have a conversation with God, and He has told me how He plans to bring together the plan for the ages, or how He is going to bring about global awareness. And of course, this is something I have to do. Now, every time I go into mania, I am consumed by it. When I come out of it, I am normal, but still believe it. I mean, what better thing is there to believe than God has chosen you to do an earthly mission for Him? Anyone out there and anyone else out there in the same boat? What do they call it? Grandiose delusions. And she posted this on the Icarus Project website, and I wrote to her offline, hold on to those delusions. I think that you do have a mission from God. Anyway, I told her I was a psychologist. At that time, I don't think I convinced her. She wrote me back and asked me what kind of mental illness I had. Actually, the thing was, I was basically, I'm trying to, what I hope I want to do, and that's why I want to, even at the risk of making people mad, because in the leaders in the movement, because I'm saying that we have to go further, I want to create what I call I've been influenced by spiritual teachers, in particular. Well, I was in the Eastern Orthodox Church for a while, so, I did quite a lot of reading in Christian mysticism, but I was also very influenced by Sri Aurobindo. Have you heard of him?
No.
The Indian, he lived from, I don't want to make it sound like he's one of these gurus that goes around. There's so many of them in America trying to make money and to have sex with women and call themselves gurus. I'm going to say he lived from 1878 to 1950 when they weren't doing, they weren't coming to America to make their fortune. And so, anyway, he was considered one of the great philosophers, great Indian philosophers. So, but the thing unusual about Sri Aurobindo, who I quote in my book, is that he was a messianic philosopher, very much steeped in Indian mysticism, but believed also in what in Western terms is called the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God on earth. And there's no good term for that in Eastern philosophy, because it's such the emphasis is so much on merging with the Godhead. Of course, the one experience of his was experiencing God in everyday life. At least one of the aphorisms of the Upanishads is God is one without a second. In other words, there's only God. So that is opposed to
As opposed, okay. And on that note, we're going to take our leave. It has been a brilliant conversation. The Spiritual Gift of Madness is the book. We've heard your background. We've heard the path that you've been on, which led you to start writing this book, interviewing people, putting it together. Your goals to get the message out there, and your goals to affect change in the movement. I hope that those things come to pass. Do you believe that we can change the world?
Well, the way I look at it is that this is our last chance, and it certainly doesn't. If you don't believe in miracles, it doesn't look too good. But I'm taking a different path here, and by doing something that's never been done before, in terms of saying that those people who are considered schizophrenics are not just shamans. That's been said before, but I tried to show that the ones that think they have a mission do have a mission. The ones that think they're Christ are Christ. It might not be in the exact same sense that you, and I'm talking to people now in case any of them are listening, think you're Christ, but your mission is to give birth to the new messianic era, which has been described as the kingdom of heaven on earth. And if you don't like Western Christianity, you can read Sri Aurobindo's work or other people like that in the East who say the same thing. The only reason I say is I don't know is because here we're in a position now in which global warming is getting worse and worse. Bill McKibben, who wrote a piece that went viral on the internet just several months ago, about a month and a half ago, called The Mathematics of Global Warming. And basically, if they don't leave that oil in the ground, we're doomed. They have to leave the oil in the ground. But that oil is worth trillions of dollars to them. And the people who are in power now care more about trillions of dollars than they do about their children or their grandchildren or even where they're going to be 10 years from now. They're so deranged and so the corporate capitalist state has taken us to the point where it's no longer like Rosa Luxemburg said, socialism, or I'm not preaching socialism, but some kind of transformation or barbarism, some alternative to corporate capitalism or barbarism. It's an alternative to corporate capital, what I call the kingdom of heaven on earth, in terms of, or it's the extinction of the human race. I mean, that's what the scientists are telling us now. So I'm putting my bet on a miracle, and I'm putting my bet on people in the Mad Pride movement accepting a different kind of narrative. The narrative being not that they're mentally ill, but that they have a divine calling to participate in saving the world by getting out there the idea that the kingdom of heaven on earth is something that we can create, that God wills to create the kingdom of heaven, and that by surrendering to God and doing justice, that is possible.
Seth Farber, that's a brilliant way to leave it. Thank you very much. I wish you success with your message. Thank you for making time to speak to us on the Irish side of the moon. Many of the great prophets of the past experienced madness, a breakdown followed by a breakthrough, spiritual death followed by rebirth. With the advent of modern psychiatry, the budding prophets of today are captured and transformed into chaotic mental patients before they can flower into the visionaries and mystics they were intended to become. As we approach the tipping point between extinction and global spiritual awakening, there is a deep need for these prophets to embrace their spiritual gifts. To make this happen, we must learn to respect the sanctity of madness. We need to cultivate mad people. As the blurb for Seth's book, The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement. The author is Seth Farber, and he was my guest this time on the Irish side of the moon. I'm Michael Eddy signing off.
We are Irish side of the moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.
I still have a dream.
This is just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.